Hey everyone, Mikki here. You're listening to Mini Mikkipedia on a Monday, and I'm carrying on with my Metabolic Mastery series. And today I am focusing on visceral fat, talking about understanding it better in different contexts, risks, so what places you at greater risk, and also what about strategies for reduction. And I know in other podcasts like insulin resistance, absolutely a lot of this is covered, but I just thought I'd want to put it all in one place. And it's absolutely tied to the other topics that I've been chatting about. So visceral fat, unlike subcutaneous fat, which is just under the skin, and if you took a pinch of, say, around your hips, on your thighs, on your butt, the soft fat that you can pick up, that's subcutaneous. It's under the skin. It's fairly inert, is how people describe it. Visceral fat is stored deep within the abdominal cavity, and it's wrapping around internal organs such as the liver, pancreas, and intestines. And initially, visceral fat does serve a functional role in cushioning and supporting organs. However, excess accumulation can lead to significant metabolic disruptions. And it's not something that you necessarily see. Unlike other fat stores, visceral fat behaves more like an endocrine organ. So it releases inflammatory cytokines and hormones that influence whole body metabolism. However, what I would say, of course, is there is the other types of fats that I'm not really covering today, but it's like the brown fat and the beige fat, and that contains a high number of mitochondria, which influences the color that you might see if you were to view it. And that is, of course, metabolically active in a really good way. Visceral fat, though, in excess, tends to create a more inflammatory environment. And that is one of the issues with visceral fat. It produces pro-inflammatory cytokines such as IL-6, TNF-alpha, C-reactive protein, and this drives systemic inflammation. And that's going to have impacts on your body's receptors' ability to read messages from enzymes and other chemicals that are trying to do their job properly. Excess visceral fat is strongly linked to impaired insulin signaling, a key driver, as you know, of metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. It also contributes to higher levels of cholesterol, which are more atherogenic, so may build up in the artery walls and create issues around blood flow and lead to things like heart attacks and strokes and things like that. But also the inflammatory nature of visceral fat, the systemic inflammation, is really bad for vascular health as well. And it can also increase blood pressure, which, as you know, by stiffening and hardening the arteries and increasing blood pressure is also bad for cardiovascular health. There is a connection between visceral fat and metabolic associated fatty liver disease, which further exacerbates metabolic dysfunction. And there is emerging research which links visceral fat to increased risk of cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, and dementia. And systemic inflammation and hormone imbalances related to visceral fat can contribute to higher risks for certain cancers. Now, I am going to talk about, the link between visceral fat and estrogen and testosterone, but there are other hormones that are influenced by visceral fat. First of all, let's think about cortisol. I mentioned this in the cortisol episode, but chronic stress leads to elevated cortisol, which promotes fat storage, particularly in the abdomen region. Cortisol increases glucose release from the liver. This is, of course, an evolutionary response, triggering insulin resistance and making fats in the visceral area more likely. And sleep deprivation, overtraining for athletes, and mental stress do and can keep cortisol levels high. And this can perpetuate visceral fat accumulation. And I do think that elevation in cortisol that many women experience around perimenopause, etc., can drive some of that visceral fat, abdominal fat that we see. But leptin and ghrelin, which are appetite hormones, also play a role. Leptin resistance, which is common in increased fat deposition, can disrupt the satiety signal, and it leads to overeating because leptin is the hormone that keeps us satisfied and keeps us full. Ghrelin is a hunger hormone, and this spikes when we are sleep deprived or in a caloric deficit. And this can also increase the drive to eat foods which are highly refined and processed for that sort of quick dopamine hit, but also that quick increase in blood sugar that we often are after. And poor meal timing exacerbates this hormonal dysregulation, which makes visceral fat loss harder. So obviously managing stress and optimizing sleep are just as important as diet and exercise in reducing visceral fat. An area I also want to talk about is like the beer belly and moobs. You guys know what I mean by moobs, right? So first of all, beer belly, which is the hard protruding abdomen that you often see in middle-aged men, but actually I'm seeing it more and more, like in men who are, in their late 20s, early 30s. So characteristically, it's a hard, round belly that many men develop, and it's primarily due to excess visceral fat, which pushes up against the abdominal wall. Unlike subcutaneous fat, which is soft and pliable, visceral fat sits behind the abdominal muscles, so this creates a firm, protruding appearance. The contributing factors to this are a high calorie intake, potentially from beer, is one of the risk factors. For example, 500 mils of beer contains around 200 to 250 calories, which quickly leads to a calorie surplus and fat gain. And I do actually just want to focus a little bit on this alcohol aspect here, because of course, regardless of what you drink, alcohol-wise, it does impact on metabolism. So the body prioritizes burning alcohol over fat and carbohydrates. It slows fat oxidation and increases visceral fat accumulation. Some beers, particularly the craft beer, is pretty carb heavy, so it can also increase that spike of insulin and promotes fat storage. Alcohol in general alters gut bacteria, and this increases inflammation and fat deposition. Much as the way we were talking about poor gut health can lead to insulin resistance last week. And alcohol can disrupt sleep patterns, which exacerbates those increasing cortisol and insulin responses that comes with disrupted sleep and sleep deprivation, both of which promote visceral fat gain. And then if we consider moobs, so this is otherwise known as gynecomastia, which is the enlargement of breast gland tissue due to hormonal imbalances, higher estrogen and lower testosterone. There is also pseudogynecomastia, and that is just chest fat accumulation due to subcutaneous fat rather than glandular growth. And I suspect that what we see when we see moobs in a lot of men is actually the pseudogynecomastia rather than true gynecomastia. Alcohol and how this contributes is alcohol lowers testosterone, particularly beer, and it increases estrogen, so that promotes fat storage in the chest. Beer can also contain plant-based estrogens such as hops, and some people suggest that this can further disrupt male hormone balance. Visceral fat does actually convert testosterone to estrogen, so the more visceral fat you have, the greater that aromatization of testosterone to estrogen occurs, so that can compound the problem. A compromised liver due to alcohol just struggles to clear estrogen, so it leads to higher circulating estrogen levels. And men with higher visceral fat and insulin resistance are at greater risk of that gynecomastia or pseudogynecomastia, particularly people who drink more than 14 standard drinks a week, and individuals that might be exposed to endocrine disrupting hormones such as the BPAs, processed foods, and plastics. So that is something which I was thinking about as I was formulating this episode is, what is it that contributes to that beer belly? Is it actually visceral fat, or is it just subcutaneous fat and not as dangerous as what we think? And then what is that relationship between the gynecomastia or the moobs and visceral fat? In fact, moobs are not visceral fat, but they're related to those other hormone changes, which I mentioned before, I think still as important to address because it is linked to metabolic health. So something else, which I just mentioned, is the role of the gut health and microbiome in visceral fat accumulation. So if there's an imbalance of bad bacteria in the gut, a dysbiosis, that can lead to inflammation and metabolic dysfunction. And a high processed fat and a high sugar diet does promote the release of these lipopolysaccharides, LPSs, into the bloodstream. This triggers systemic inflammation, encouraging visceral fat storage. Therefore, if you do have some sort of gut dysbiosis or increase in this sort of systemic inflammation from the lipopolysaccharides, that is what you want to address, in addition to other things that can help you reduce visceral fat. And I'll talk about them in a minute. I mentioned the role of sleep and circadian rhythm. As you know, and I'll just repeat myself, higher cortisol and ghrelin, which is a consequence of lack of sleep, will lead to more cravings, particularly for sugar and fat. You've also got increased insulin resistance, so glucose is less efficiently used, leading to fat storage because it's more likely to be stored. And lack of sleep and high cortisol does decrease melatonin, because melatonin and cortisol sort of work in opposition to each other, and this impacts mitochondrial function and metabolism. I mentioned meal timing a little bit, but eating late at night does reduce the body's ability to burn fat efficiently, and the liver doesn't love carbohydrate late at night. We are much more insulin sensitive at the start of the day than we are at the end of the day. So these are other things which could contribute to the visceral fat accumulation. And of course, genetics, as I talked about, it doesn't rule everything, but it certainly can play a role in our overall health risk. Some people are genetically predisposed to store more visceral fat due to variations in genes like the FTO gene, which is linked to a higher appetite and fat accumulation, the PPARG gene, which influences fat cell differentiation. I mentioned that fat cells that are hypertrophic, which don't differentiate, are more sort of problematic than the ones that differentiate. And also the IRS1 gene. This affects insulin sensitivity. In addition, prenatal stress, childhood obesity, and even maternal and paternal diet during pregnancy, so both mother and father, does influence how and where fat is stored later in life. Lifestyle interventions, though, can override a lot of these challenges, and understanding and knowing better your genetic profile can, of course, help. But the recommendations for reduced visceral fat probably don't change regardless of whether or not you know your genes. Briefly, let's chat about menopause, aging, and visceral fat. There are some changes that occur in hormones across first into perimenopause and then, of course, postmenopause. So the declining estrogen leads to a shift from subcutaneous fat on the hips and thighs to more fat that's stored around the middle, and with it, more visceral fat, so more fat stored in and around the organs. The lower estrogen level also increases insulin resistance and inflammation, because estrogen is an insulin sensitizing hormone, and this further promotes that visceral fat storage. And also with aging comes sarcopenia, or it can, which is muscle loss. And loss of muscle slows metabolism and reduces fat oxidation. So this is, of course, why we have the recommendations that I've talked about in the last couple of episodes, and of course I will talk about here, to help reduce that visceral fat storage. Lifestyle stuff is even more important as we age. There are environmental factors which can definitely influence visceral fat accumulation, and we're beginning to understand this more. So there are plastics, chemicals such as BPA, phthalates, PFAS, or polyfluoroalkyl substances, and pesticides can all mimic estrogen and promote visceral fat accumulation. And these are found in plastic containers, cosmetics, non-stick cookware, and processed foods. BPA is a synthetic chemical used in plastics, food containers, water bottles, and can linings. And its effect on visceral fat can increase fat cell differentiation. It can promote insulin resistance. It alters hormone balance, leading to higher estrogen levels, which can be problematic, as I've just mentioned earlier. Whereas the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, the PFAS, are a group of over 4,000 700 synthetic chemicals used in non-stick cookware, such as Teflon, waterproof clothing, food wrappers, and firefighting foams. And they're known as forever chemicals because they don't break down in the body or the environment. And emerging research suggests that these disrupt thyroid hormones, so can slow metabolism, promoting visceral fat accumulation, can also interfere with insulin signaling and increase inflammation. And we often talk about BPAs, and you know that there are bisphenols which are not BPA, but they may just be as harmful, such as BPS, BPF, BPAF, and BPB. And these are found in things like the receipts that you get from the supermarket or from any store, BPA replacements in plastics and food containers. Bisphenol AF are used in electronics and plastics, and BPBs are found in some plastics. And some of the health concerns around this is that it mimics estrogen, promotes visceral fat storage, and increases insulin resistance. And interestingly, BPAF are a stronger endocrine disruptor than BPA, so it absolutely affects fat metabolism. And so BPA free doesn't always mean safe. So just be mindful of that. And just so you know, the best approach with these endocrine disruptors is to reduce your exposure to them using glass, stainless steel, or ceramic for food and drink storage, and saying no to receipts. And if you work in a job that requires you to be touching those receipts that come out when you purchase something, you might want to wear some gloves. That is actually the recommendation. Anyway, moving on, mitochondrial health and energy efficiency. So poor mitochondrial function can also lead to fatigue, reduced metabolism, and inefficient fat burning. So be mindful of that because this does increase your risk of visceral fat accumulation. And then chronic low-grade infections such as H. pylori, Epstein-Barr can increase inflammation and visceral fat accumulation. And that's actually a whole issue within itself. And there are, I talked on my podcast to Dr. Christabella Yeo of mitochondrial health and infection and immune system. So that's actually a really great episode. We didn't talk about it as it pertains to visceral fat, but a lot of really great tips in there. So how do we reduce and avoid visceral fat? Some of the stuff we would have obviously covered because it's all in that metabolic health family. You guys know about protein intake. Aiming for a minimum of 1.6 to 2 grams per kg of body weight per day helps preserve lean muscle mass, improves satiety, reduces excess calorie intake. Focusing on a really good sort of whole food diet and reducing refined or high carbohydrate diets and, of course, sugar. So the carbohydrates that you do eat, make them things like legumes, potato, kumara or sweet potato, and low sugar fruits such as berries, they're more like fiber, apples and pears and things like that. Also thinking about your fiber intake, aiming for a minimum of 10 grams per 1,000 calories. And in fact, that's probably a bit low. Like even if you aim for 25 grams of fiber a day, I think that's a really good thing to sort of shoot for. And you can absolutely go for more as much as your gut can tolerate. Omega-3 fatty acids from actual food, such as fatty fish, does reduce inflammation and improve fat metabolism, but I do have a recommendation for omega-3s sort of beyond that. And also, if you do have visceral fat, which you can get this stuff measured as well, then restricting the window with which you eat could actually be quite helpful for you. Now, I didn't talk about how they measure visceral fat. And often it's measured using a DEXA. So this is one of the most accurate ways to measure visceral fat, and because it provides a breakdown of fat distribution, distinguishing between that subcutaneous and visceral fat. This is often used in research in medical settings. You can also use an MRI or a CT scan, and CT scan is considered the gold standard for measuring visceral fat, providing that cross-sectional image of fat distribution. MRI scans do offer high accuracy, but are expensive and probably not available for routine use. And BIA machines, bioelectrical impedance, some of those advanced body composition scales estimate visceral fat, but I mean, these are less accurate, and I wouldn't sort of hang my hat on this. They may be helpful for tracking trends over time. But of course, a simple waist circumference measure, where if you're a guy, a waist circumference above 102 centimeters or 40 inches indicates high visceral fat, whereas a woman above the 88 centimeters or 35 inches also suggests increased risk. And that would be measured at the smallest part of the torso or at the belly button while standing, exhaling gently. I mentioned waist to height ratio of less than 0.5 as being ideal for metabolic health. For example, if someone is 170 meters tall, their waist should ideally be under 85. There will be some structural sort of individual differences here. Just do remember that. And a higher body fat percentage measured using calipers, especially in the abdominal region, would suggest a higher visceral fat level. So these are the different ways that you can measure, but I think that using the DEXA or a CT scan, I'm not sure how many people would actually use that, could actually be the way that you would look at that. Now, exercises. So resistance training increases muscle mass, as you know, which enhances our metabolic rate, improves insulin sensitivity. It is the organ of longevity, and it's the reservoir where our glucose is stored. So the more muscle, the more glucose you can store. High intensity interval training HIIT is effective at mobilizing visceral fat, even with these short duration sessions. So things like sprint intervals, kettlebell swings, battle ropes, things like that. And of course, any kind of aerobic training can enhance fat oxidation and will reduce visceral fat accumulation over time when combined with a calorie deficit. And always, of course, just move, both in activity and out of activity. In addition to that sort of non-exercise activity thermogenesis, walking, standing, things like that will help increase the caloric burn, reducing overall fat distribution or overall fat accumulation in the presence of a calorie deficit, reducing that visceral fat. If we think about supplements, we do have a bit of a list. And look, supplements are just that. They would supplement your overall protocol. But something like berberine at 900 to 1500 milligrams a day, divided in 2 to 3 doses, taken before meals can improve insulin sensitivity. And it's actually comparable to metformin for blood sugar control. Anything that helps with blood sugar stability will help with visceral fat reduction. Omega-3 fatty acids, so 2,000 to 3,000 milligrams a day or 2 to 3 grams a day, looking at both EPA and DHA, which hits and targets both like reducing inflammation and also increasing that plasma membrane content of the omega-3s. So it can also improve lipid metabolism. Curcumin, which is a turmeric extract that's in a form such as with piperine or as Mariva or theracurmin at 500 to 1,000 milligrams a day. It is a potent anti-inflammatory. Green tea extract, EGCG, 200 to 400 milligrams a day, aids in fat oxidation, enhancing thermogenesis potentially. This is all in the context of a calorie deficit, by the way. Magnesium, 300 to 400 milligrams a day as a glycinate, a citrate, or threonate or malate to help support blood sugar stability, insulin sensitivity, potentially reduce cortisol, and it can have an effect on the brain, reducing anxiety and things like that. Zinc at 10 to 30 milligrams a day as a picolinate or biglycinate may enhance testosterone levels, help insulin function, and it also is involved in digestion and gut health. Probiotics, looking at 10 to 50 billion colony-forming units a day. So lactobacillus and bifidobacterium for gut health and fat metabolism, but also butyric acid, which you see in the pendulum supplement, which I really love. That helps increase that butyrate, which is what the gut bacteria feed on in a good way. Vitamin D3, 2,000 to 5,000 international units a day, along with K2, supports hormone balance and metabolic health. Resveratrol is also recommended, but I don't think that's overly bioavailable. So I'm unsure about that, but 250 to 500 milligrams a day. Alpha-lipoic acid is often mentioned in the context of metabolic health, 300 to 600 milligrams a day, enhances insulin sensitivity and mitochondrial function, best taken before meals. And then you've got L-carnitine. And Dom D'Agostino talks a lot about L-carnitine. He takes 3 to 6 grams a day. to help the shuttling of fat to be used as an energy source. So these are all some things to consider when you are thinking about visceral fat, if you know that this is something that you want to reduce. And I would say that if you're carrying excess weight, particularly around the abdomen, then that is something that you do want to address. So hopefully some of this stuff may be helpful for you if you're not already doing it, albeit you probably already are. All right, guys, you have a great week. You can, if you've got any feedback, questions, etc., drop me a line at Mikki Williden, Instagram, Threads, or Twitter, at Mikki Williden Nutrition on Facebook, or head to my website, mikkiwilliden.com, and book a one-on-one call with me. We can talk about whether your strategy for reducing visceral fat is going to actually move the needle. All right, have a great week.